So, welcome back to another episode of Seek a Psychology. Today, we're going to be talking about getting back into the gym and just making sure your headspace is correct when you get back into some structured training. So obviously for a lot of ye, depending on what country you're in, you might have been in lockdown or you've just gotten out of lockdown, or it appears as though your lockdown will soon be over from COVID-19. And what's going to happen is we'll get a lot of athletes coming back into a gym training environment or maybe a group training environment, and their headspace can range all the way from being quite apprehensive about returning to a kind of social training environment all the way through to a maladaptive headspace where they might be pushing themselves too hard. They might expect to have previous 1RMs or previous levels of performance, even though their capacity might not be there yet. So the first thing we're going to talk about is our kind of perception of 1 rep max lifts, or our perception of maximal performance. If you're in the case where you haven't gone and trained at a certain facility for 8 weeks, be that a running track, be it a court where you play whatever sport it is, or a gym where you have access to kind of a barbell and plates, your current capacity is going to be very, very different from what your capacity will have been if you've just gone through a 6-month training cycle. Oftentimes what we see is we get the classic case of a CrossFitter returning to a gym, and they're going to think, okay, my clean and jerk was 100 kilos when I stopped training. Of course, the first thing I'm going to do and my first week of training will be try and hit max lifts. Obviously, your lifts are going to be significantly lower, and there's no reason you would possibly go and hit max lifts after kind of a week of training. But you need to kind of start looking at your perception of this and looking at your perception of where you're currently at and frame it positively. So if I was to return to training and the first thing I do is go and try and hit a 5 rep max on my back squat so I can start a new training cycle, it'll be much more beneficial for me if I start off with like just the next step up from bodyweight training. So a weight that I know is going to be achievable, an amount of volume I know will be kind of effective, but also that I'll be able to recover from. So everybody, or a lot of you, will have heard of the term MRV, so maximum recoverable volume, the most volume you can do and still be recovered in time for your next session. If you haven't trained in a while, or if you've been training but not at an intensity level, so maybe not with the weights or not at a speed or not with a group that brings out a certain level of competitiveness in you, if you haven't been training at that intensity in a while, your MRV is going to be very, very low. So when you go back in for your first session, stop thinking about kind of old numbers. Stop thinking about needing to test yourself and see where you're at. Just find an effective working volume. So for squats, that might be 3 sets of 10 at 35 to 45% of previous 1 rep max. You know for a fact you're going to be able to do the weight. You know 3 sets of 10 probably isn't enough volume where you're going to be super beat up afterwards. Yet it's going to be effective in building your work capacity, and when you go to do higher rep sets next week and 2 weeks after and next month, that 3 sets of 10 will have been very, very beneficial for you. The next thing we'll talk about then is kind of alternative goals to be setting at the start. So most of us are used to an outcome driven goal structure where I will say in 6 months time I want my deadlift to be X, I want my back squat to be whatever number, I want my bench press to be whatever number. Due to the fact that we are usually following on from a previous training cycle, or we've been playing a sport, like we might have been playing rugby all season and we're coming into the gym and you're in pretty good shape or you're in okay shape when you start those training cycles, it's possible to have an outcome driven goal structure and for you to go and be able to kind of linearly build up and hit whatever number it is, or hit whatever amount of sets, or hit whatever outcome you want to hit. The thing is, for a lot of people, you have probably had around 12 months of broken training. It's very, very unlikely you would have really, really good structures, unless you're lucky enough to have a good training facility at home. It's unlikely you'll have had good structures around training. So if you're coming back in and you're trying to plan the next 4 months of training now, hopefully everything will stay open and we can stay training. But if you're looking at the next 4 months, it may not necessarily be the best thing to do to just pick certain outcomes you want and kind of linearly stack those on top of each other. So it mightn't be the best thing to say, okay, I want 180 kilos or 405 pounds. I want that for 5 reps. 2 months later, I want to hit 200 kilos for a single. 2 months after that, I want to hit 210 kilos for a single. Those are things we're used to thinking about because we're probably coming in a fairly good position, and this is more a tapering phase or a peaking phase for 3 months. When we're in the situation whereby we've had 10 or 12 months of broken and unstructured training, the capacity simply isn't there to build linearly on top. So what we need to start looking at instead is, okay, my goal for the next month is that I'm going to train 4 times a week. Or my goal for the next 3 weeks is that I won't deviate from my warm up and cool down routine, or I'll spend X amount of time on recovery work each week. It's more looking at the process of how you're working rather than an outcome you want to get from your training. And to be honest, long term, if you're an athlete and you want kind of prolonged success in a certain sporting realm, the process driven goals are much, much better. The third point, and this is the penultimate point for this video, touches on something we've just been talking about, and that's the support systems that we rely on as strength athletes or as power athletes or whatever kind of athlete you are. So if I'm a weightlifter and I think about support systems, oftentimes people will think about like, okay, physiotherapists, they might think about recovery protocols, they might think about a host of other things. But in reality, support systems to muscle contraction are your cardiovascular system, your general health, so like your heart rate, your blood pressure, all your normal health markers, and then your kind of mental well-being. So how well you're functioning from day to day. Are you flourishing? Are you languishing? How you actually feel around training. A lot of the times we have so much momentum built up by the time we get back into a training environment that we're so excited we leave a lot of these things go to the side. So if I haven't touched a barbell and plates in 2 or 3 months and suddenly I can see the barbell and plates there, I want to go and do weightlifting or powerlifting immediately. But I may not necessarily have the aerobic capacity to effectively recover in between sets of snatches, or I might not have the general health markers there that I can go and push myself really hard 5 or 6 times a week without getting run down or without getting sick or overtraining. So what I would say is, if you're in this situation, or if you know this situation is coming up for you, like we have a lot of athletes in the UK at the moment who are looking for the 12th of April, I think is their date. They're looking forward to this. They're getting back into the gym. Granted, if they're on programs with us, they're going to be having very, very structured training, but all the other rules still apply. They haven't been in that environment. They haven't been getting the same stimulus. They haven't had possibly that competitive drive from having other people around them. They may not have had access to the same kind of equipment. So all of these things are so important. And if they're any of our athletes, the first few weeks in the gym, they're going to make sure their aerobic capacity is probably pretty good. They're going to make sure their mobility, their recovery, all these boxes are being ticked before we can go straight back in and do some sport specific training. The last thing then will be a kind of positive framing or a positive spin on how we perceive this situation. So we've heard from a lot of people in the last few weeks, and they're saying, oh, like to both myself and Owen, like, Darry, this is absolutely terrible. I've lost a year of my competitive career. Depending on where you are in terms of age, that might be, I've lost the year that I'm 27 or 28, and this is when I should be at my strongest, and I'm kind of getting on in years now. And people have this negative connotation around how this year has affected them in terms of their training or in terms of their competitive outcomes. Realistically, situations like this don't happen where everybody is hit down at the same time. So you have everything from Olympic level athletes all the way down to amateur level and entry level athletes are all being affected in the same way. Unless you have some sort of elite status, you don't really have access to your coaches or to the facilities you'd usually train in. And so it's just important to note that everybody has been painted with the same brush. So rather than constantly thinking about this as a negative thing, oh, I find it so hard to, lose weight when I don't have access to the gym, or I find it so much harder to do my mobility work if I'm not doing it in a class. start looking at this a small bit more positively. You could have just had the best 12 months of your life in terms of doing some prehab or some rehab on an old injury. There are things you can achieve when you're still in lockdown and still not able to avail of coaching or avail of a certain facility or avail of a mindset or a competitive environment that will really benefit you for the rest of your athletic career. So I really hope this video helped you. If you've any questions, pop them in the comments below. If you've other steps besides these steps mentioned in the video, I'd really love to see them in the comments, and we'll try and get some conversation going. If you want coaching, consultancy, programs, anything like that, go to seekstrength.com, and thanks very much for watching.